every Jewish home should have one, and every home should have one actually, because it's a subject that's not really been dealt with properly except in bits and pieces, and I think it deserves to be read. We know intuitively that there were Jews in every theatre of war in World War II, but I always ask the question, well, who were they and what were the battles fought? And I've done the homework and I've detailed the details. I've named names and told you where you can look up the detail if you want to take it further. And I was always very inspired by the help I got from non-Jewish people, because in the course of doing this, of course, I contacted many veterans organisations across the world. And the phone calls and emails and letters I got from non-Jews who said, yes, you know, Moshe Greenstein, he was my great friend, terribly brave man, saved my life at such and such a battle. That kind of response was very common. I never had one negative reply except one. And I was especially pleased to be able to pay tribute in the book in one chapter to the auxiliary services, in this case the fire service, about which I have a particular interest. And my colleague Stephanie Mortman, who isn't Jewish, helped me write this book, and it's a very underwritten section of World War II history. Thousands of Jewish firemen and women took part in this part of the home front. Many were killed. We had over 70 killed, including fire watchers. And as we speak, Stephanie and I are still compiling a list of all those who served. It's very difficult because the records are scattered, but we only got down to the letter D in the alphabet, and we already have about 4,000 names. So it's an astonishing contribution. Most of the firemen were in fact either World War I veterans who were too old to fight, or very young men and women who weren't yet eligible for call-up, or people who were not fit for the war services but could fight and do their job in the fire service. So I was able to do that, and very pleased I was to be able to make that contribution. I talked a bit about anti-Semitism and people talking down the Jewish contribution or even denying it took place in some cases. I was reminded, I'm thinking about it the other day, we have on a tape at the museum recorded sometime in the early 80s 2 Jewish veterans speaking on a Jewish radio program, which is broadcast on the BBC. And he told this story. On one of the Ajax parades, when there were far more men and women able to parade than now, of course, so many have passed away. The Jewish veterans who march on the Sunday after the National Remembrance Day, of course, they also go to the National Parade. We have our own one on the Sunday afterwards in Whitehall. They were marching around the Horse Guards Parade under Admiralty Arch, and one of the Jewish ex-officers was standing as a marshal by the side, and a very posh woman behind said, "Not many of them are there." So he turned around and said, "Madam, this is only the 1st Battalion. The others are following behind." And of course, after a few minutes, several thousand more men with their standards and women marched, some in uniform. And she said, "Not many killed then." So it seems that you can't win whatever way you look at it. But I think that kind of sums up the attitude I'm trying to deal with in the book. We've never been more than about 0.5% of the population of Britain, but I've done the arithmetic and our fighting contribution was way out of proportion to our numbers in the population, both in frontline units and in the receiving of awards for courage. As an illustration, at Arnhem, for example, the Jewish paratroopers were 2% of the strength of the 8,000 to 10,000 men who dropped behind to try and capture the bridge over the Rhine. And as aircrew in the Battle of Britain, 1.2%, over twice our numbers. At Arnhem, 4 times our numbers in the population. This is the only way of reckoning it. And if British jury numbered at the time as a guesstimate of 300 to 350,000 in Britain, we know we had about 60 to 70,000 in the forces, because that's how many chaplains' cars we've got, and we know a lot of them are missing. So you can modestly say that 20% of the Jewish population were fighting. And that's an astonishing figure, and is a little bit above the national average. 3,000 were killed, and almost 800 from Israel, the Palestinian Jews. Sadly, and I want to say this especially, the part played by the Jews from Israel is I think, deliberately erased from the memory of those who were keepers of the British war remembrance communities. They never appear in any British tributes to the Commonwealth or Empire forces. I've seen many exhibitions about the contribution of British forces and minority groups, and the Jews from Israel are always left out. And I remember at an exhibition at the Imperial War Museum about 10-15 years ago, I complained to the director of the museum, and he said, he used the very lame excuse, well, it wasn't part of the Commonwealth. So what? They were in the British Army, and they came from that part of the world, and we had a bit of an argument by letter, but they didn't put it right. And there are many other examples too. For example, someone from the Israeli embassy is never invited to lay a wreath, senator, and yet people come from all over the Commonwealth and former British Empire and are invited to lay a wreath. And yet 30,000 Palestinian Jews, Israelis, fought in the British forces and played a major role in some of the special forces in Ethiopia and in SOE in southern Europe. And Hannah Senech is one of them. She's mentioned on the exhibition out there, and there are many, many others. And I often get asked this question, what drives somebody, what drives me to write a book like this? I mean, I'm just an ordinary person. I went to university, but I'm not a historian by profession. I was a teacher for many years. And I've only done this really in the later years of my career, when I've had time and children have grown up. And I think the fact is, and there are some people here of a certain age who might be able to empathise with me. When I was growing up, I was born in 1947, my father and all my uncles, and I came from a big family, always talked about the war. Whenever the family was together, the war was a major topic. I always went on the Ajax parades to see Dad and all my uncles marching. It was a huge thing of pride for me. I was brought up on all those comics that some of you will remember, the war comics that used to be published in those days, and still are, I think. And the films, you know, the Pinewoods films, The Wooden Horse, Colditz, later on, The Great Escape, the Battle of the River Plate, many, many others, and they keep repeating them on TV. And the TV documentaries, War in the Air, The War at Sea. I was brought up on this diet, and obviously people get affected by it in different ways. It wasn't shoved down my throat by any means, but I began to develop this very strong sense of Jews fighting back. And we also came from a Zionist home, again, not overtly, it was just, you know, in the background. And I was very aware of this feeling that we did so much, but you very rarely, if ever, hear about it. And as I began to read, I realised that a lot of this story of the Jewish fight back was marginalised or invisibilised. And when there were overtly Jews appearing in films or in books, it was never said that they were Jewish. You just presumed by the name. It was Goldstein or Weinberg. But they never said, you know, this was a Jewish officer and you give this wonderful thing or whatever. So that had an effect on me. I'm also very interested in oral history. Much of the work I do is based on interviewing veterans, and they are an ever-declining source, I'm afraid, sadly. We're living on the cusp of these men and women who are passing away. And I've tried very hard, whilst working full-time, although I'm just now retired, to record their memory. Finally, a word about memorials, because I touch on this a little bit in the book too. When a memorial is put up to heroes of the Second World War, First World War, we often don't know who the instigators are. It's a kind of non-transparent process. It's a bit like the giving of awards. And when you find out who's responsible and you write and say, well, this isn't right, you get what's the word, stonewalled. And I want to give two examples which refer to Jewish commemoration. One is the Battle of Britain Memorial on the embankment, massively important memorial. The Battle of Britain, iconic battle, saved Britain undoubtedly from Nazi invasion. And in all the books about the Battle of Britain, and I researched this quite deeply for my chapter on Jewish aircrew who fought in the battle, and there were quite a lot, Israel is named as one of the participating nations because George Goodman, who was born in Haifa of British parents, actually a British father, is named as the one Israeli, and you'll see his mention of it at the end of the film, The Battle of Britain. They did their homework. And in many of the books about the Battle of Britain, including the classic one, Wynn's Men of the Battle of Britain, where he gives biographies of all the 3,000 or 4,000 men who fought from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and so on, including one or two from India. He's mentioned there as being Palestinian. However, the people behind the memorial, including Lord Tebbit, thought that they wouldn't put this on. This was political hot potatoes. So I wrote and said, what are you doing? You know, Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, at least put it on as an acknowledgement. Goodman was born in Haifa. I sent them his birth certificate in Hebrew, as well as the English language one from the British consul. They wouldn't buy it. They said he had a British passport. And I said, well, he's also entitled to a Palestinian passport, which was the same as the British one, but it was a Bordeaux colour rather than blue. You remember the old window passports we used to have? No, they wouldn't accept that either. And we had quite an acrimonious exchange. Lord Rothschild got involved. I had to apologise. Lo and behold, a few years ago, we discovered that George Goodman's mother was Beda Lerner, born in Zichron Yaakov, and was as Jewish as the chief rabbi. So he was halakhically Jewish, and he was born in Israel. The Israeli Air Force regard him as their first ace, but the memorial lies. And that's, I think, a cause for great concern. The other one, not so serious, but very bizarre. If you go to near the palace, there's that new memorial, relatively new, to the Indian and African troops who served in the Commonwealth, and rightly so. Terrific contribution. Baroness Flavor was behind this. She is a Hindu member of the House of Lords, and she raised the money, and she was told by the lottery fund, you won't get the money unless you mention the Africans too. She wanted it only for the Asian contribution, so she had to include the Asian. So I went to see her with Rebel Jana. He introduced me, we went to the House of Lords, we had tea, and I said to her, why don't you, instead of making it exclusive, why don't you wind it? Mauritius, Cyprus, the Pacific Islands, just in small carving, nothing big. Israel, I threw that in, you know, and I mentioned a few others. Not Australia and New Zealand, they have their memorials. Oh, she said, I'll think about it, and of course nothing came of it, so that fell by the way. But if you look in the little rotunda next to the memorial, which lists all of the Asian Victoria Cross and George Cross holders, you know, the real big stuff, you look at the top, it's got Simon Latouzi, who was one of the Jewish George Crosses. This is a guy born in Camden, and with Russian-born parents. What's he doing on the memorial to Indian African troops? When I wrote to her, she said, oh, we've included all the George Cross and VC holders who fought with Indian and African troops. But they're not Indian and African, I said. I don't mind it being there, but people are, you know, you're not, the memorial is not being straight. And I never heard it. What I'm saying is remembrance is a funny thing. So always beware and always question some of the things that you see.